Reach up to the top of Michigan, to the long finger of land called the Peninsula that juts into Lake Superior, and to the wild island of Isle Royale offshore, and you will find the ground marked with old wounds. Pits, depressions in the rock and soil, some shallow, some deep, running in lines along the copper-bearing ridges. Not dozens of them, thousands. To walk that country is to move through 2 ages of mining at once. The modern mines, the shafts, rock piles, and ghost towns of the great 19th century copper boom are impossible to miss. But scattered among them, older and quieter, are the ancient pits, subtle dents in the ground, filled with leaves and time, easy to stride past if you don't know what you're seeing. Together, they make the Quinault one of the most intensively mined stretches of land in North America. They are ancient mines, dug by native peoples to pull native copper, pure metal, out of the rock, beginning thousands of years ago. And they gave rise to one of the most repeated claims in American mystery lore, that an enormous quantity of copper was taken out of this land in antiquity, and that nobody knows where it went. The metal, the story says, simply vanished. From that empty space, a whole shadow history has grown. If millions of pounds of copper went missing, somebody must have carried it off. And so the tellers reach for lost civilizations, for Phoenicians and Minoans and ancient Europeans crossing the ocean to strip Michigan of its metal and haul it home. Part of what feeds that fantasy is a real and honest moment of wonder. When 19th century miners cut into the ridges and kept discovering that someone had been there first, old workings, stone hammers, the charred wood of ancient fires, they were genuinely unsettled. Who had done this? Where had they gone? Those were fair questions. But into that honest wonder, a century of tall tales came rushing. Here is the honest truth, and it's the reason this story is worth telling straight. The copper is not missing. Nobody carried it across the Atlantic. There is no continent-sized hole in the record that needs a lost race to fill it. We know, in broad and satisfying strokes, exactly where the copper went. And the real answer is far grander than the myth, because it isn't about a vanished people at all. It's about a living one, and a trading world so vast it laced half a continent together thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The pits are real. The copper is real. The mystery is the only part that was invented. And to see how, you have to do 2 things. First, take apart the claim that anything is actually missing, and then follow the copper on the long journey it really took, out of those Michigan pits and across the map of ancient North America. Start with the missing millions, because once you look closely, they start to disappear. The whole mystery rests on a single number, the claim that some staggering tonnage of copper, often quoted in the billions of pounds, was mined in antiquity and cannot be accounted for. Pull on that number, and it comes apart in your hands. To begin with, nobody actually weighed the ancient output. The giant figures come from old, loose estimates, someone guessing at the volume of the pits, multiplying by guesses about how much copper they yielded, and arriving at a total that sounds precise but is really a guess stacked on a guess. When you tighten those assumptions, the mountain of missing metal shrinks dramatically. There is no reliable measurement showing that billions of pounds were removed at all. It helps to see where the big numbers came from. In the 19th century, as the ancient pits were rediscovered, observers tried to estimate how much copper had been taken, and some early guesses were wildly generous. Later writers seized on the largest of them, repeated them, rounded them up, and gradually a soft old estimate hardened into a hard modern fact, billions of pounds gone. Each retelling made the number feel more solid and left it less true. Then there's how the mining actually happened, which was nothing like an industrial operation. The work stretched across at least 1,500 years, and probably far longer, carried out by relatively small groups. Archaeologists suspect much of it wasn't even organized prospecting at first, that people gathered copper in the course of ordinary seasonal rounds of hunting, fishing, and foraging, working a pit here and there over countless generations. Spread a modest amount of mining across that much time and that many hands, and you don't get a vanished industrial hoard. You get a long, patient trickle of metal. So the premise is faulty twice over. The amount was never as vast as claimed, and it was never gathered in one great burst that would demand one great explanation. Remove those two errors and the whole missing copper mystery loses its foundation. There is no enormous, unexplained absence crying out for Phoenicians. The lost civilization writers then supplied the missing shippers. If the metal was gone, someone must have carried it overseas. And so ancient Mediterranean sailors were written into a story they were never part of. It's tidy reasoning on a rotten foundation. It invents a disappearance, then invents a culprit to explain the disappearance it invented. But that still leaves a real and genuinely interesting question. The good version of the one the title asks. Real copper was mined here, in real quantities, for thousands of years. It was made into things. So where are those things now? Where did the copper actually go? Not into a myth, into a network. And you can follow it. The copper left the Kohinoor the way valuable things have always left their source, in trade. The people of the Lake Superior country hammered the native metal into knives, spear points, awls, fishhooks, beads, and ornaments. And those objects traveled, passed from hand to hand and group to group, along routes that reached astonishing distances. Follow the trail and it fans out across the eastern half of the continent. Lake Superior copper turns up far to the south, far to the east, carried hundreds and even thousands of miles from the pits it came from. It reached the great mound-building cultures of the Ohio Valley, the Hopewell, who gathered exotic materials from across the continent and buried their honored dead with copper ornaments in their ceremonial earthworks. It reached down the Mississippi world towards the Gulf of Mexico. Copper artifacts have been found in ancient sites from the Great Lakes to New England to the Deep South. The distances are hard to picture. There were no wheels, no pack animals, no sails on the inland waters, only canoes, footpaths, and human muscle. For a copper ornament to travel from Isle Royale to the Gulf, it had to pass through many hands and territories, traded on again and again down a chain of communities that never saw either end of the journey. The network wasn't a road, it was a relay running for 1,000 years. One of the most striking examples is Poverty Point, in what is now Louisiana. A vast, sophisticated earthwork site, more than 3,000 years old, near the mouth of the Mississippi system. Among the goods that flowed into that place from far away was copper, hauled up the river networks from the north. A metal from a cold Michigan peninsula ended up in the hot lowlands of the Gulf Coast, 1,000 miles and more from where it was dug. And copper wasn't ordinary cargo. In many of these cultures it was precious, a material of status, ceremony, and the sacred, worked into gleaming ornaments reserved for important people and rites. That is exactly why it traveled so far and ended up in graves and ceremonial mounds. It was treasure, and treasure moves toward power and gets buried with it. This is the real shape of the answer. The copper didn't disappear. It dispersed. It was scattered, deliberately and steadily, across a continent-wide web of exchange. The same web that moved obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, seashells from the Gulf, and mica from the Appalachians into the same hands. Native North America, long before any Europeans set foot on it, was crisscrossed by trade routes carrying precious things over enormous distances. And Lake Superior copper was one of the star commodities on that network. So the metal is exactly where you'd expect traded goods to end up, spread thin across 1,000 sites, worn as ornaments, buried in graves, treasured far from home. But that raises a sharp question. How can anyone actually prove a copper bead in a Louisiana mound came from a Michigan pit? For a long time, that was just an assumption. Then chemistry gave us a way to check. Every copper deposit carries its own faint chemical signature, a particular mix of trace elements and impurities picked up from the specific rock it formed in. In principle, that signature is a fingerprint. Read it in an artifact, and you can point back toward the source the metal came from. In recent years, scientists have learned to read those fingerprints with real precision, using techniques like laser ablation mass spectrometry, which can sample a tiny spot on an ancient object and measure its chemistry in fine detail. Point that tool at copper artifacts from distant sites, and you can begin to test the old assumption directly. Did this really come from the Great Lakes, or somewhere else? There's a real difficulty the scientists had to overcome, and it's worth being honest about. Native copper is unusually pure, which means its trace element signature is faint, and different sources can chemically overlap, making them hard to tell apart. Early attempts to source copper were fiercely debated. It took better instruments and more careful sampling before the fingerprints could be read with any confidence, which is why the firm results are recent. The results have done two things at once, and both are worth telling honestly. First, they have confirmed the broad story. Great Lakes copper genuinely did travel, and its chemical fingerprint shows up in artifacts far from Lake Superior, including at major Hopewell sites in Ohio. The trade network is not a guess anymore. It's measurable. But the same science has also complicated the tidy picture in a way that's more interesting than the simple version. It turns out Lake Superior was not the only source of ancient copper. When researchers tested copper from sites like Poverty Point and from Hopewell Mounds, they found that some of it came not from Michigan at all, but from other deposits, notably the southern Appalachian Mountains. Different objects, even at the same site, traced back to different sources. The ancient copper economy wasn't a single pipeline out of one peninsula. It was a rich, tangled web of multiple sources feeding multiple social networks. That caution is a strength, not a weakness. It means that when the analysis does point to the Great Lakes or to the Appalachians, the conclusion has been tested and argued and checked, not assumed because copper must have come from the most famous source. The trade network we can now describe is built on measurement, not convenient guesswork. That is what real evidence usually does. It answers the question and then makes it deeper. The copper from the Kohinoor is accounted for. It went into the trade. And at the same time, we've learned the trade was even bigger and more complex than anyone assumed. Which brings us back to the peninsula and to the last piece of the copper's whereabouts. So where did the copper go? Put the pieces together and the answer is complete enough to close the case. Most of what the ancient miners took was hammered into tools and ornaments and carried out along the trade routes, dispersing across the eastern half of the continent, into the mounds of Ohio, the earthworks of the lower Mississippi, the graves and villages of 100 peoples from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. It is sitting right now in museum collections and archaeological sites spread across a huge sweep of North America, exactly where a traded commodity ends up. And whatever the ancient miners left behind in the ground was largely taken by a second wave of mining entirely. The industrial copper boom of the 19th century, which tore into the very same Koh-i-Noor deposits and pulled out billions of pounds of metal for the modern world, often reopening the ancient pits to do it. Consider that second modern harvest, because it dwarfs anything the ancients did. In little more than a century, industrial mining pulled something on the order of 11 billion pounds of copper out of the Koh-i-Noor, a figure that makes the old workings look like the gentle scratching they probably were. If you want to know where most of this peninsula's copper truly went, much of it went into the wires and pipes and machines of the modern world, within living memory. There is no missing copper. There is copper that was traded, copper that was buried, and copper that was mined again in modern times. Every pound of the mystery has somewhere ordinary and real to be. And notice what the myth costs, because this is the part that matters most. To say, nobody knows where the copper went, and reach for a lost white or old world civilization is to take a genuine, magnificent achievement away from the people who actually accomplished it. The truth is the opposite of a vanished race. It is a present one. Native Americans who mined metal for thousands of years and built a trade network of continental scale, moving copper from a Michigan peninsula to the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, long before Columbus. That's not a hole in history. That's one of the great untold stories of the ancient Americas. So go back and stand among the pits on the Koh-i-Noor, those thousands of old scars in the rock. They are not the wound left by a people who came, stripped the land, and vanished. They are the starting point of a journey, the first step of a metal that fanned out across half a continent, carried by human hands over thousands of miles and thousands of years. The copper went exactly where the people who valued it sent it. We just had to stop looking for a lost civilization long enough to follow the trail they actually left. And it leads not out to sea, but deep into the heart of Native America.